Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. I'm joined by my co-host Chris, not from Australia or in Australia right now. Chris, how are you doing?
Doing well. This looks a little different, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. We're like official news anchors this way, right?
A little bit more professional than usual.
A little bit more professional. We're surrounded by a lot of equipment.
Right. And coming to you from a very rainy Seattle. It is, or Redmond anyway, in the Seattle area. Day one of the MVP Summit. Feels like it's been a week already, to be honest. But with jet lag and all of the running around, it's kind of been a fun start to it. Really looking forward to getting kind of this wrapped up today. Beautiful studio that we're in. This is, like I said, very different for us compared to normal, but very excited about it as well.
Yeah, so this is great. They call it the DevRel Studios nowadays, but people might know it as the Channel 9 Studios, where they did the Channel 9 recordings in the past. And when I started with Azure years ago, I was watching Azure Fridays every week. Yeah. And right in that corner at the other side of the camera, I actually recognized the background.
Right.
So that was where the desk was, where they did the weekly recordings. So it's really cool to be here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, celebrating Exchange 30 years. 1996, the first version of Exchange came out. So it's
You
kind
were
of been
there,
fun.
I assume?
I was not. But it has been fun being on campus and actually catching up with people. You know, I've been working with Exchange for a little over 25-ish years now. And so it's kind of been fun to catch up with people that have, a lot of folks are still around that have been, working with it as long as I have, and even before. We have some legends in the messaging space that are around campus this week as well. Yeah. So that's kind of been really fun for me.
Yeah, and maybe fun for people to know who are listening or watching. So this week is MVP Summit. So all the MVPs around the world are invited to come to the Microsoft campus in Redmond. So everybody is crawling around campus, a little bit like hooligans or something, right? Without the harassment and the damage.
That's right.
But it is 3 days of sessions in all kinds of categories. But yesterday was a pre-day.
Yep.
So we had some pre-day sessions, and on Friday there's a post-day, some workshops going on. But the main event is 3 days. And it's really cool that Microsoft reached out to the community and say, hey, well, we have those cool studios over there. If you want to use it to make some content, go ahead, make a reservation. And I'm glad we got in.
Very cool.
There was a long waiting list, I
think
heard,
so. And I think they said at the keynote this morning there were around 1,600 folks on, actually here in person for Summit. So, it's a reasonably large size event, I guess, for a community event. But yeah, super happy to be here. We got some great topics for you today as well. I'm really excited because as always, Koos produces his notes a little bit ahead of schedule compared to me, and I had to skim through them, and I was like, wow, this is going to be fun, right? So, Koos, what are you telling us about?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically a data breach which happened recently in the Netherlands from a company which we know in the past as T-Mobile, a communication provider, which is now called Odido. Everybody in the Netherlands have heard that name a lot during the last couple of weeks because there was a big data breach. More and more details came out. I'm not going into all the details, but there were some few things I want to cover which I think still are going wrong at my customers. I see them configured incorrectly, and I wanted to make sure that my listeners are not fooled by the same attacks as Odido fell for.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. And I'm going to go into some Active Directory security mistakes. I came across a post a couple of weeks ago by another MVP, actually. You might know him on Twitter, Tech Spence. His name is Spencer Alacy, and he had written this, just a simple post about, don't do this, right? The sort of 9 things that are misconfigurations in Active Directory that folks kind of miss or ignore and could lead to some sort of dire consequences. So it really resonated with me because I do a lot of work poking at AD for customers, right? Especially legacy Active Directories that have been around for a long time. And so these things were it was just such a nice list of things that I thought, let me take that list, let's talk about that list, and add a little bit more context to some of these things and provide a little bit more information on how you could audit your environment for some of these things. How do you look for them? And how do you build a plan to resolve them? So hopefully another interesting show for everyone.
Yeah, well, attackers love Active Directory for
right.
obvious reasons, but we still cannot get rid of it, right? Especially the large organizations. So it's good to have it secure as best as possible. So I'm looking forward to your topic today as well. And you have a lot of PowerShell in the show notes. Spoiler alert!
Yes.
So it's a fully fledged blog post already. So please make sure to check that out.
Koos isn't the only one dropping code today.
No. Let's keep it technical.
Yeah.
So on to the Odido breach. So again, Odido is maybe a little bit of an odd name. It's a relatively new name. In 2022, T-Mobile sold off their Dutch telecommunication branch to a new investor group, and that's why the T-Mobile name went away and a new name came back. But it is, well, T-Mobile is known obviously around the globe. So it's a large telecom operator, and they fell for an attack. Which made it so that a lot of their data, personal data from the customers, landed in the hands of the attackers. The attackers asked for 1 million euros of money in exchange to not publicize the data, but Odido did not agree with their terms, did not pay, and then the data became public. And this is accounting for 6.5 million people, actually.
Wow.
And as you know, the Netherlands is not that large of a country.
Yeah.
That's 1/3 of our population. So this is immediately the biggest data breach we got to see in our country, unfortunately. And it's not only personal information, but also bank account information, social security numbers, but even some sensitive notes from help desk employees from the service desk containing all kinds of different personal information about the customers. So it was really a bad day for data security, actually. And there were lastly more and more details surfaced about the attack and how the attacker group called Shinyhunters extorted T-Mobile in exchange for their data, and also what the attack path looked like and how they came in. There's actually a great write-up by my colleague Maarten Goed. He published a great in-depth article with a lot of links to other research about the topic, and he covers a lot of actually the entire kill chain, and he also mentions a lot of Microsoft security technology out there which could have prevented each of the steps. But one thing that really stood out, well, actually two things stood out, is that one crucial element was vishing, so the voice phishing, and a device code flow is very popular with this Shinyhunters group, and I wanted to highlight and emphasize those two topics to dig in a little bit deeper.
It's interesting because €1 million doesn't seem like a lot for a ransom, right?
No,
it seems like a low enough ransom where you would just give me my data back, right? But we also know that if you continue to make it profitable for the bad actors, they're going to continue to do it, right? So you can kind of understand the moral dilemma there. But I had heard just recently as well that, and I believe it was actually Shinyhunters, they were actually recruiting, especially females, to do these phishing attacks for them. So they're actually paying folks for their voice to be able to, because it sounds a lot more convincing if you, maybe have a native speaker of the language that you're trying to phish, or someone who has an accent or a dialect of, in the region of where,
Good that you say that, but that was exactly the case. So the attacker, the original contact, was speaking fluently Dutch.
Yes.
And that makes it easier to fool for certain tactics.
Yeah.
And I mentioned Vishing earlier when I went to DEF CON last year in Las Vegas. And I was really impressed by the Vishing competition there on stage.
Yes.
People doing real-time voice phishing and try to get in and try to get information, as much information as possible. And it was really clear to me that instructing your employees to be aware of this, to make sure that even if somebody says they're from an IT department, make sure that you schedule an appointment to call them back at a set time, for example, that you receive a meeting request from your internal organization. That already helps, but they are very clever. And in this case, the phishing attack actually prepared with a device code flow authentication ahead.
Yeah, wow.
So device code flow authentication, for people who not know, is a authentication used by a lot of, how do you say that, headless authentication, or how do you say that? So by devices like Teams rooms or televisions or even PowerShell scripts.
Yeah, and it's typically when you're using it on devices that can't fire up a browser,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
oftentimes if you do, I guess if you're authenticating a PowerShell module or something, and you have a browser available to you, it will pop the browser up for you to enter
Yeah.
your creds. But there are scenarios where you there's no browser maybe, right? Maybe, or you're running some OS where you can't use a browser. I use it a lot when I do things on Linux because I'm running a VM
Yeah.
that I'm connecting to remotely,
Great example.
and so when I do whatever I'm doing, usually I look for device code auth because it just gives me the little code and it's much easier to do.
Yeah.
Or scenarios where you have possibly a customer you're authenticating a script that has to run with a higher elevation than what you have.
Yeah.
And so I don't want the customer to have to give me their username and password or a username and password. I just want them to authenticate it for me and I can run it, and then that works for that too.
And that was what happened. So the attacker in this case requested a device flow, a device authentication code, and they asked the employee in this case to go to a website, but it was not even a phishing website. It's a legitimate Microsoft authentication page for device authentication, and they just asked them to type in the device code. And then the authentication is a normal authentication. You're authenticating against, well, let's say PowerShell for Azure or something. And even the passkeys we touched on earlier would not prevented this because it is a local authentication on the local machine with local hardware.
And you could imagine how that is, the pretext to that from the Vishing core, right? Because you could sell it as, well, it's going to be really secure because I'm going to give you this secure code. Put the secure code in. You don't have to tell me your username and password. I don't need to know that. And you can kind of sell it as under the guise of tech support or something like that, right? So I can imagine users falling for this pretty easily.
Yeah, and in this case, once the employee of Odido, in this case, completed the authentication, the attacker, which requested the device authentication in the first place, now had a session token. And with the session token, all the SSO authentications are also vulnerable, of course. And in this case, data was pulled in from Salesforce, the application they use at Odido to track all the customer service activities and all the personal data. There was also an issue with least privilege not being applied in this case because a service desk employee normally should not have been able to access the APIs from Salesforce to do the mass data exfiltration on Salesforce. So that was a second thing that should have prevented it. But in this case, the attackers now had free roam to the data, and they used the API to gather 90 gigabytes of data containing all of these personal sensitive details. So So again, phishing is very something that we should fix on a human level, make people aware of this. But the device code flow is obviously a very dangerous one, and I still see this being available at a lot of my customers.
Yes.
And I know Microsoft, it's been already a while that Microsoft is advising against it. But like you said, if it's used in scripts, for example, it's just easy to keep using it. And people might say, well, we'll see if it's really vulnerable for that. So Microsoft did a couple of things. Microsoft calls it their Secure Future Initiative, where they group a lot of best practices and some base policies. And even they now automatically deploy a block conditional access policy into every tenant, put it in report only, and I believe after a certain couple of days it automatically gets enabled unless an admin consents against it, and that's what happens with a lot of customers, unfortunately.
Yeah, I must say, I'm not a fan of these like forced policies that get, I'm a fan of strong guidance, but it's hard, right? Because if you look at it from Microsoft's perspective, tenants are taking hits, they've got to do something. If they don't do something, everyone looks at them and goes, well, Microsoft isn't doing anything to help us with this. So it's sort of this double-edged sword, but it's at least they're trying to do something about it.
Yeah, so I actually constructed a short list of what I think every listener should do and check right after listening to this episode. First of all, check your sign-in logs and see if device code authentication is even used in your environment. I put a KQL query in the show notes. You can just run it against your sign-in logs, and you can see if device code authentication is used, by whom, for which specific application, and this really helps you to scope the conditional access policy, because obviously I'm preferring completely blocking it. That would be best, but I can also imagine that there are some situations like those team rooms, television screens, maybe some scripts being used where you want to still be able to allow it, but then at least scope your conditional access policy with some, open it up, so create some narrow exceptions, if you will. So one thing you can do, instead of all users, exempt some users, maybe some admins or a group of Teams clients, for example. You can also add some specific network locations to be allowed.
Say, that would be a good one, right?
Yeah.
So ignore, if it's coming from outside the environment, then
On the other hand, for Odido, the service desk employee was probably in the network, so that would, in this case, would not have solved the issue. But also, you can also exempt resources. So instead of having all the default Microsoft client IDs available for device code authentication, if you know that you only use it as a CLI, chances are low that that client ID was actually used by the attacker, but it's still not foolproof. So be careful with those exemptions, I would say. And you can start in report-only mode if you're unsure about potential impact, and then just have I don't know, something on the calendar, and a week later or something, 2 weeks later, review your logs and then enable it and make sure that you get rid of these authentications.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
Yeah. So I hope this will help people to reevaluate their device code flow authentication. And again, a little bit of a plug, go read the blogs and links in the show notes. I put Maarten's blog in there and some other resources as well. Most of them are in English, so even our English listeners can still learn from that. So, and otherwise we have AI to translate.
Right. We're translating the encrypted text from Dutch.
Yes, yes. So Chris, tell me, what's on with Active Directory?
Yeah, so like I was saying, sort of in the in the intro here, this was something that I really resonated with me, and I think if this breach, sort of Odido breach story, tells us anything, it tells us that breaches are not always these sophisticated sort of kill chains and 0 days and all of that, right? Which is, I think the media sort of tends for us to, we paint this picture in our mind that you're going to get breached. It's going to be 60 people in a room, with the most sophisticated stuff ever. But oftentimes it's just a misconfiguration or a legacy setting or something that you've just set and forget many years ago, right? And unfortunately, Active Directory is very, very guilty of this because it is such an old platform. And for a lot of environments, Active Directory has been there 20, 25 years. As an administrator, you've inherited an environment that was possibly built by someone else who is no longer around. So there's all these sort of long tail of previous best practices and stuff like that we need to get better at checking and auditing and keeping an eye on, right? And I think that's why this sort of post, and again, it was an MVP called Spencer Alacy, and I really hope I'm not butchering his last name there. But
sorry, Spencer.
Yeah, sorry, Spencer. He wrote a really, really good piece that I've sort of based today's topic off, right? And essentially the point he makes is there's 9 things in Active Directory that, if you're sitting or you're listening to this today and you still run Active Directory, these are sort of 9 really important things that I would say, go and check this stuff, right? Even if you've gone through recent audits or what have you, go and have a look. And there are tools around that you can use. Sempris has a really, really nice tool called Purple Knight. Purple Knight will almost certainly flag up all of these things if you were to run it and they haven't been addressed, right? And so, really, really good idea. And sort of starting off, probably one of the sort of most important things, is weak passwords or reused passwords. Passwords are sort of the bane of Active Directory existence, right? And we're doing all these things in the cloud with passkeys and FIDO and all of the stuff to try and ease the burden. But unfortunately, when it comes to AD, you still got to make sure that if you have an Active Directory environment and folks are logging into it, that there's some level of sort of password management and complexity requirements there, right? And it's kind of controversial because in a lot of environments, folks are still using 60 or 90-day password expiry policies, right? Yeah. It's forcing users to reset that. That hasn't been a thing for a while. In case you kind of missed that, I think the latest NIST guidance even says that as well, is you really only should force a reset of a password if you have evidence that there's been a breach. So I would say, take that bear that in mind as well as you sort of go through this. But complexity and minimum length requirements are still really, really important, right? So what do we do with this stuff? I think it's always a good idea to kind of audit the stuff, have a look at the password sort of the passwords in your environment. There are some tools around. DS Internals is one of those tools. You can kind of help identify weak passwords. Obviously, you can cross-reference password hashes with Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned?
Yeah.
That's a good way. There's some really good scripts around as well. PowerShell scripts around that will look at your AD password hashes and feed them up to the Have I Been Pwned API.
It's an Entra ID P2 feature, right? To have the password hashes synced and checked with online databases.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
P2 has that. P2 also has all like the custom password protection policies and all of that type of stuff as well. So if you are syncing into Entra, that's obviously a way to do it. There are so many tool sets and vendors out there that do stuff. SpyCloud is another one who has a way of sitting on your domain controllers, and actually every time a user changes their password, it will inspect that password, go and check their own sort of dark web databases to make sure that that password isn't breached and all of that type of stuff. So lots of stuff there, but ultimately pay attention to your passwords. I've got some PowerShell in the show notes here on looking at fine-grained password policies, looking at passwords, for example, users who have passwords that are set to never expire. That's one of the things I always look for in ADs.
Service accounts, right?
It's an immediate way to pick up a service account, and also that'll be a way to once you've identified that service account, probably some of these other points here, the rest of the 9, there are other things that probably will be worth looking at as well. So if you think about, number 2 is overly broad permissions on OUs and security groups and stuff like that, right? Active Directory permission inheritance is difficult, right? And the reality is no one's using a newly built, fresh Active Directory. And over time, people go in, unclick inheritance or apply all to all, everything and below. So you end up with this mishmash of permissions, and it becomes really easy for accounts to be inheriting a permission that you don't intend for them to be inheriting, right? Group policy links, all that type of stuff. Like this over permission piece is something to really look at. File shares also, right? And again, you have a file share possibly that is a really old file share, Back in the day, it was always easy, just NTFS permission that thing, everyone, all, right?
Yeah,
and then do the sharing bit.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
pay attention to that type of stuff. So you can audit this stuff. There are tools out there. Bloodhound's a really good one to look at attack paths.
Yeah.
I will warn you though that
that's what attackers will use as well.
Right, Bloodhound will, and because of that,
Yeah.
Bloodhound can be really noisy in your environment, right? Your SIM will know, or your SOC will know when you run it. So obviously make sure that you bear that in mind if you are going to just be blasting tools into your AD. If you are monitoring for stuff, it's more than likely that something like Bloodhound will light up a dashboard for you.
Yeah, Microsoft Defender for Identity and endpoint and everything, it will definitely light up. Yeah.
So have a look at those things, audit ACLs, especially when if you have sort of tier 0, tier 1 type assets, right? Again, PowerShell is your friend with this type of stuff. One that I think that's really, really important is to look for the DC sync right on non-admin accounts. That's another one where, because if you have the DC sync right, you could essentially replicate all of Active Directory. So it's a way to sort of, attackers can use that to establish persistence in AD by essentially creating a dummy domain controller, right? So something to look for as well. So really take your time, and like I said, this can be really difficult. I've had very large enterprise environments where I've spent 6 months working on fixing inheritance and fixing things, and there are ways you can do it. Oftentimes it's easier to just reset and start from scratch, right? So you can reset objects and user objects and computer objects and all of that to a default state, so they get the same permissions they would have if they were newly created, and then you reapply your model. So you spend a lot of time building out your model, your RBAC requirements, all of that type of stuff beforehand, and then you sort of run and execute. And I've done this successfully with some large customers where we just take an OU at a time, reset, reapply what we want the model to be, make sure we test everything, make sure that support staff can do the things they need to do, right? Your delegate model, if you've got delegated permissions for your support folks. It can be hard, but if you're going to keep Active Directory around, and I think it's pretty fair to say that a lot of organizations are and will keep Active Directory around for at least
still be there for a couple of years.
Yep. Take a look at the stuff, because this is AD is your vulnerable area, right? It's that soft belly that folks are going to be attacking. So Thinking about endpoints for a second, I think we've all heard of LAPS, or sort of your local administrator password solution. Way to control local admin passwords and credentials on your fleet, right? So instead of having a generic local admin account on all your machines, better to have LAPS. That information is stored in an attribute in AD, and when an administrator needs to log onto a machine, they can query that particular object and get the local admin password for it. So
a really cool feature, by the way, and I still don't think we can take it for granted that every customer is using this.
Yes, and that's the thing, right? So a lot of environments we walk into, there isn't LAPS, or there's some other way of trying to manage this. Now, if you've invested in a third-party solution that kind of manages this type of local admin stuff for you, that's great too. But I think one of the challenges and one of the things that to think about here is, just because you have LAPS doesn't mean that all your machines are in compliance, right? So you want to make sure that you have LAPS, but you also want to make sure that you monitor LAPS and LAPS compliance on your endpoints. So make sure that your sort of domain-controlled machines are actually calling in that that the LAPS policies are applying to them, right? So you can do that by checking to see if they actually have a password stored. And I got some PowerShell here for that, and some PowerShell to see when was the last time the password was reset and updated, right? Is another thing. If it's stale, or if it's been sitting for a while, or what have you, there may be an issue with the machine. It may not be getting the policies pushed down. So not only do you want to make sure you have LAPS, you want to make sure that you're monitoring LAPS and making sure that it's working as it is,
That's a
or
good
as
point.
it should.
Yeah,
right?
you shouldn't take it for granted that it rotates and everything automatically.
Yeah. So that's one thing to look for. Number 4, certificate services, right?
Yeah.
ADCS. We went through a time, and I want to say this is probably circa 2013-ish, where everything on-prem needed a certificate, right? If you had Link server, you needed a certificate. If you had SharePoint, you needed a certificate. If you had Exchange, you needed certificates. And so we all had to become certificate, authority people at that time. And so what we found was that everyone was deploying ADCS because that was the easy way to do internal certs. But most folks were just deploying ADCS in its base default configuration and never actually went back to check if it needed any hardening or any of that type of stuff. And so what we've come to see now is that ADCS is sort of one of the most under-audited sort of attack paths in the enterprise, right? In many environments, those certificate authorities have just been sitting there for years. No one's touched them, no one's updated them, and no one's checked to see if there are issues with certificate templates and all of that type of stuff. And guaranteed, if you're running a default install of ADCS and you run a tool like Purple Knight, it's going to flag up that there are at least 2 or 3 certificate templates that are, misconfigured, or at least too open for your environment, right? So what you could do with those is you could do all sorts of weird enrollments and permission assignments based on the certificate template, because any Active Directory user can enroll into the template or use the template for things. So that one makes a loud noise every time you run it, any sort of auditing tool. For good reason. It's a topic that hasn't been very well discussed or documented in a while.
Would you even go so far, perhaps, to have companies consider moving away from ADCS and use some kind of cloud solution?
Yeah,
perhaps?
look, if you're not using it, or if you're using it for very specific or simple workloads, there may be cloud options that are better suited. Unfortunately, the CA browser forum and certificate industry in general is becoming a bit of a mess at the moment, right? Because they're forcing lower certificate life cycles or lifetimes, which I think is it's a good thing in a way, but also a lot of it is not needed. I think eventually by 2029 or something, we're going to go down to like 43 days on certificate lifetime, right? I don't know that hopefully by 2027, you're not running Exchange on-prem anymore. But I don't know that I want to be automating something like Exchange, because it binds certificates to SMTP, it binds certificates to IIS and all these other things. It's not as easy as just
It's also a new attack vector.
Right. It's not as easy as a Let's Encrypt certificate that just renews itself and restarts a service, right? There's a lot more to Exchange than that. So it's an interesting one. I would pay attention to see what's out there. If you are still using these things, look at them. We've actually listed this sort of escalation paths. There's 8 of them that are sort of fairly common, and I've listed them in the show notes. And you can run a tool. Certify is one of the tools you can download for Windows. Locksmith is a PowerShell module that will help sort of you identify these things. But again, guaranteed if you run Pink Castle or Purple Knight, tools like that, it's going to go find the misconfigured templates in your AD environment. And many times all it is the template itself is just permissioned too broadly. It's by default, any authenticated user can enroll using that template. Yeah. You just want to remove that to make sure that bad actors can't go and do funky things, right? So if you're interested in this topic as well, Michael Van Horenbeek has on his recent episode on his podcast,
Zero Trust Zone.
Zero Trust Zone.
Yes.
He actually talks about this as well. So it's something that's coming to light again, which is great because it is, potentially a bad thing. So spend some time looking at it. So number 5 in the list here is regular users that have admin rights granted to them, right? This you do find a lot, especially when you have the person who built AD in, 2000 or 2001.
But not even AD environments, even fully cloud-native environments. People just think it's normal to
And it's an interesting conversation because if you think about our modern environments and how we administer things like M365 and Entra, we recommend using PIM, right?
Yeah.
And so we've always recommended having multiple accounts.
Yeah.
And then now we've started saying, well, you've got to use PIM as well, so that, or privileged identity management, so you can elevate to the role that you need only for the time that you need that role. But what I've seen a lot of folks do is because they now have PIM, they feel like it's safe to just use their regular account. Because I'm not a global admin full time. That's safe, isn't it? No, it's not safe because you are going to elevate yourself to global admin, but you're still running Outlook with your email on that account. You're still surfing the internet with that account. You've still got Teams going on with that account. So you're not safe ever having an elevated account that also runs applications and day-to-day things. Exactly the same applies to Active Directory, right? You don't want to be, and you can see this. There is a particular sort of attribute on an account where you can actually see when the account has in its lifetime has been given admin access. Even if it's been revoked, you can still see it. So it's very fascinating sometimes in older environments to go and do a run through it and have a look. And you can see exactly when this, it's a SD role holder or something like that. It's the attribute. It's just an interesting thing. But you don't want to be having regular accounts with admin granted at all. That's not something you want to do. So have a look at sort of local admin groups within your machine. If you've got endpoint management on your machine, obviously you've got some way for users to request application installs and stuff like that locally. So you're not going to have giving them local admin accounts and stuff like that. So there's a lot to it there, but think about how you do that one. And similarly with when number 5 and number 6 are very similar. The one deals with local admin on your workstations, your endpoints, and the other one deals with privileged groups like domain admins that have regular user accounts in them, right? So you want to kind of look at that and make sure that you don't do that. There's some ways that you can look at interactive logons, for example, with tier 0 accounts or local admin accounts. And I've got some event IDs in the show notes that you can kind of look for to do that as well. Tightly coupled to that, number 7 is logging on to untrusted hosts with domain admins, right? Again, you don't want to just be logging on to, and it becomes quite easy for folks to go, well, I need to administer the server. Oh, I'm just going to remote desktop to that server, right? So kind of happens, but every time you do that, those credentials are being cached on that server. And yes, they're cached in memory. That's what it is. It's LSAS, and it's in the LSAS memory. But if someone already has some sort of foothold on those devices, it's trivial to use something like Mimikatz to dump the LSAS memory and try and figure out a way to move and elevate those accounts. So again, got some event IDs here that you can kind of look for to show security events for account logons like domain admins and enterprise admins logging onto machines, your tier 0 groups. Obviously, you can use any EDR telemetry that you have. And this, I like to I don't like to assume that every environment has a fully functioning SIEM, and we'd love to think that everyone can just, here's the KQL, go off and go and do it. But the reality is a lot of folks are not quite there yet, right? So you can still find information by just searching and looking at your audit logs and stuff like that. So pay attention.
I think it would be a good idea, by the way, if an AD admin is aware of all the attack vectors which are there for Active Directory, and perhaps participate in some kind of training, like maybe a red team assessment, to see how Active Directory is attacked, to get a better understanding of where to be more cautious. 100%.
If you see what can be done in a standard default Active Directory environment, right? It's quite scary how quickly it can, someone can elevate from nothing at all to domain admin, and especially if they really are, familiar with how to do it. So you're right. Being familiar with the tactics and techniques, all of that type of stuff, helps you better understand how to defend against these things. Yeah. So it does make sense to kind of be across that.
Yeah, and perhaps even if you're using Active Directory, consider using Defender for Identity to have a sensor on all the domain controllers. Yes. Then at least if somebody is going to touch your LSAS database, it is flagged and it will result in a security incident somewhere.
And I did, it's quite funny that you mentioned that, because I did an exercise for a customer a little while back where I was trying to, I made a copy of their Active Directory NTDS.
Just to be sure, on your USB drive.
I made a copy of it because I wanted to see if we could crack any passwords on it, right? Yeah. And I was able to get onto a box, make a copy, and exfil the copy without any alerts. Right, wow. Which was obviously a telltale sign that we needed to pay more attention to how, what our alerting looked like for stuff like that, like logon events onto domain controller, right? Making a snapshot copy of ntds.dit should also have triggered an alert, and then they're trying to exfil that thing. I just copied it onto my desktop,
Crazy.
So those types of things, you got to look at these things, and if you understand how some of these things are done, then it becomes easier to build those types of alerts and react to them, right? So down to the last two here. So number 8 is folks not using the protected users group, right? There's a group in AD, protected users group. I think a lot of folks kind of think that that's a sort of an undelete group. Like if you put my account there, it's not going to get deleted. That's not what it is at all, right?
Okay.
When you put an account in there, there's a lot of sort of credential protections that kind of happen there. So, it prevents NTLM auth on those accounts. Blocks credential caching. There's a whole bunch of sort of Kerberos TGT lifetime limits and stuff like that get applied to the accounts that are in that group. So it's really worth using that group, especially for those sort of tier 0 and admin accounts that you have there, right? So obviously you want to make sure that you check the membership of protected users. Make sure that all important accounts, that are used for elevation and stuff are in there. Really, really important. If you are going to be adding accounts in there, especially if they're service accounts, we talked about identifying service accounts before. Yeah. Great way to do that. See look for all accounts in your AD that don't have a password or password set to never expire. Yeah. If you're going to then start applying protection or put them in the protected users group, it's going to block NTLM, right? So sometimes service accounts used to access old stuff will break. So you want to pay attention to stuff like that if you've got older service accounts. Obviously, you need to move forward, right? We can't just leave things hanging, but it's worth doing it step by step instead of just jumping the gun. So very important there.
It's an amazing checklist you built for us, Chris. Yeah, everybody with an Active Directory now has a 9-point strategy.
I don't want to take full credit for that. It's Spencer did the
you
hard
cobbled
work.
It together at least,
right.
And a lot of PowerShell in there as well. So
I wanted to kind of put in some information, a little bit of information on how to audit these things, right? Because obviously the solution is going to differ per environment. Not everyone's going to have the same solution in their environment, right? Obviously, environments are different. Folks run different applications and stuff like that. So to have a sort of a blanket here's how you fix it statement, I think, is a little bit misleading. But at least I feel like being able to get a handle on and be able to audit for these things, that's really important. And at least that's going to be kind of universal for most environments, right? So the last one, and we've already talked about NTLM, sort of, is using LAN Manager, which is even older than NT LAN Manager, right? Don't be using those authentication protocols, right? We already got, in M365 now, or in Entra, we block legacy authentication protocols. We don't want basic auth anymore. We want modern auth protocols, right? Well, it's the same in AD. Some of these protocols are even older. So, don't be using that type of stuff. You can look at, there are some ways that you can kind of get some registry keys and you enable some registry keys, and then, in Event Viewer, in the event log, you can get a lot of information on how to sort of find this. So I've got some event IDs there for you to look for. Start getting rid of NTLM and NTLM v1 and LAN Manager and some of these older things, right? Unsigned SMB is one that sort of goes hand in hand with this. Unsigned LDAP is another one that goes sort of hand in hand with this. And again, if you run any tools like Ping Castle or Purple Knight, these things are going to come up. And these ones are difficult to fix because you'll see that it's happening, but then you have to go and investigate the application that's doing it to find out why it's doing it. Is it doing it because it's just using an old version? Or is it doing it because it doesn't support anything new? Or is it just doing it because that's how it's always done it, and no one's ever come back in to fix it, right? So you kind of want to spend some time looking at that.
It's also a bit weird hearing you talk about all these security issues, Chris, because if you see the sessions this week, and obviously at MVP Summit we see the cutting edge of things to come. And you hear about AI and agents and virtual co-workers and Teams and Fabric. Yeah. It seems like Active Directory doesn't even exist anymore.
That's right.
Will there ever be a time, you think?
Man, I think for a lot of organizations there are very few reasons to have an on-prem AD anymore, right? Yeah. I think that unfortunately there's sort of tech debt. There's always going to be that one application that someone needs that is critical to their business, but there's no SaaS version, or it can't be easily moved to the cloud. Or the person or team of folks that wrote it originally have long since retired, and so now you've got this issue of like, well, how do we maintain the code base, and how do we update the code base? And obviously GSA and there are the global secure access stuff that Microsoft has within Entra. There are a lot of options now for being able to securely publish older apps, but the app still lives on-prem. It needs a directory of some sort. Yeah. Printing is another one that just gets a little bit difficult. But I think that most organizations should be at least on the journey of trying to see where they can reduce or remove the reliance on Active Directory. But I don't think Active Directory is going away. We hear rumors and stories about how AD is back, right? And newer versions of AD are going to have some, enhanced security features. Not to speculate, I don't know.
Well, I know retro is all the new crave nowadays.
That's right.
I think bringing AD back from the dead is a little bit going too far, right?
Yeah. So look, I think obviously everyone listening to this, if you still have AD, there's a reason for it, right? Yeah, you either have a very, very large organization with lots of, and it's just difficult because it's a slow thing. Yeah. I think not everyone is born in the cloud, right? Yeah. I'm lucky enough. I work for an organization that is born in the cloud. Like, the company's not that old, so 5 years or 7 years ago when the company was started, we didn't need AD because everything was in the cloud, right? Yeah. We use SaaS for everything. Yeah. Not every business or organization is like that.
No, that's true. That's true. So. Yeah. Well, thanks again for this comprehensive checklist, and I really like the PowerShell script. So,
well, I wanted to contribute some code to the conversation as well.
Nice work.
And hopefully, folks find this useful. I would say if you are running AD, go and just check these things out. Yeah. A lot of this can be audited without causing too much hassle. Obviously, don't run Bloodhound without thinking about it first. But other things, you can run some audits and you can get some really, really good info. Yeah. So.
And now it's time, I think, to segue into our community project.
Yes.
I see a familiar name in there, friend of the show.
Friend of the show,
Nicholas Blank. I think he would find it lekker to be in a community project.
I think so. So Nick's put together a really, really cool thing. It's an auditor for Entra apps, right? So he's called it Privileged App Path Auditor. And he's essentially what he's done is he's written a PowerShell tool that looks at the app environment, within your Entra, the apps within your Entra environment, and will help find any privileged escalation issues, right? So he also checks for things like, do we allow user consent to apps, and do we allow users to register apps? And obviously you do not want that. So the tool, the script will actually call that out if you have those settings enabled in your environment. But then he goes further to look at each app, look at actually what the permissions are that are assigned to this app, and are there any privilege escalation issues with these apps in your environment. So really useful tool. I find time and time again that customers have sprawl of apps in Entra, right? It's not only is it possibly legacy stuff where they've just over time accumulated a lot of applications because users have been consenting. Mm-hmm. And once they disabled user consent, they never went back to remove the applications because it's really difficult. You don't know who the owner of the app is. Yeah. You could break a process or you could break things. And it's really helpful to have some tools like this that you can kind of run, especially when you have a lot of apps, right? I've seen environments with over 1,500 app registrations. To go look at each and every one of those things one by one, it's going to take forever. So to have a tool like this that can really kind of spit out any like really critical issues is really, really helpful. So at least after running this, you can either be worried that it's identified stuff that you need to fix straight away, or it hasn't identified anything and you can rest easy that you don't have any like critical issues. So check it out, Mr. Blank. You can find him on social media. He's everywhere, larger than life character. And I've got a link to the GitHub repo for his tool.
And with AI and AI agents connecting into Entra, this is getting more and more important, I think.
Yes.
Because we see sprawling amounts
crazy
of
sprawl.
authentication requests there.
That's
as
right.
well.
Yeah. So
and for people who don't know, Nicholas Blank is from South Africa, so that's why I used a Dutch word to introduce him.
Yes.
I think he might enjoy that.
I'm sure he will. I'm sure he will.
Well, Chris, I think we come to an end
yes.
of a very official recording here in the DevRel studios.
That's right. We can wrap this one up.
Great to have this face-to-face as well.
Yes.
We will do another face-to-face later this year, I hope.
So. I think so. I think it's on the cards for sure. Slightly different location again. We'll see if we can get some nice lights and nice cameras for that one. But looking forward to possibly a recording from Europe sometime later in the year. So.
Yeah, I'll be welcoming you in the Netherlands.
Fantastic.
If that's going to happen.
I got to work on my Dutch, so we'll see how that goes.
Yes. Okay. Well, for everybody, all the listeners, dankjewel. Thanks for listening, and see and hear you the next time. If you have any remarks, by the way, or any questions or ideas for future episodes, please drop them in the comments, and we'll make sure to cover them in a future episode.
Absolutely. Always interested in some constructive feedback or burning issues. So, but until then, and until next time, we'll chat to you then. Thank you very much.
See you later. Bye-bye.